Caleb, an 8-year-old boy, always tried to stay strong, even when the world around him seemed unfair. But one day, after working hard on his homework, Caleb was shocked to find a hateful, racist remark written by his own teacher. Hurt and confused, Caleb kept the insult to himself, not wanting to cause trouble, but the weight of those cruel words stayed with him. Little did the teacher know, Caleb's father was someone who wouldn't let this injustice go unanswered. How did a young boy like Caleb end up being targeted in such a cruel way? And what happened next that led to the teacher facing consequences no one could have predicted? Stay tuned to find out. But before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today and if Caleb's story of courage and justice speaks to you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The bell rang, signaling the start of another school day at Oakwood Elementary. 8-year-old Caleb Johnson bounded up the steps, his backpack bouncing with each eager stride. His bright brown eyes sparkled with excitement as he entered Ms. Blake's third-grade classroom. "Good morning, Ms. Blake," Caleb chirped, flashing a wide smile that revealed a missing front tooth. Ms. Blake glanced up from her desk, her lips barely twitching in acknowledgement. "Take your seat, Caleb," she said curtly, returning her attention to the papers before her. Undeterred, Caleb made his way to his desk, greeting his classmates along the way. As he settled in, he pulled out his homework and placed it neatly on the corner of his desk, just as Ms. Blake had instructed. "All right, class," Ms. Blake announced, rising from her chair. "Let's begin with our math lesson. Who can tell me what 7 times 8 is?" Several hands shot up, including Caleb's. His arms stretched high, fingers wiggling with enthusiasm. Ms. Blake's gaze swept across the room, deliberately avoiding Caleb's eager face. "Emily," she called, nodding at a blonde girl in the front row. 56, Emily answered proudly. "Very good, Emily," Ms. Blake praised, smiling warmly. Caleb's hands slowly lowered, a small frown creasing his forehead. He knew the answer too, just like he always did, but Ms. Blake rarely called on him, even when he was the first to raise his hand. As the lesson progressed, Caleb remained attentive, absorbing every word and scribbling notes in his notebook. When it came time to work on problems independently, he tackled each one with determination, his pencil flying across the page. "Time's up," Ms. Blake announced after 15 minutes. "Let's go over the answers together." As they reviewed the problems, Caleb's heart swelled with pride. He had solved every single one correctly. When Ms. Blake asked for volunteers to share their work, Caleb's hand shot up once again. "Anyone else?" Ms. Blake asked, her eyes skimming past Caleb. "How about you, Tyler?" Tyler, a freckle-faced boy 2 rows over, stood up and read his answer. It was correct, just like Caleb's. "Excellent work, Tyler," Ms. Blake beamed. "You're really improving." Caleb's shoulders slumped slightly. He couldn't understand why Ms. Blake never seemed to notice his efforts. Was he doing something wrong? He pushed the thought aside, determined to keep trying his best. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Caleb gathered his belongings and headed for the door. Just as he was about to leave, Ms. Blake called out to him. "Caleb, a word, please." He approached her desk tentatively, wondering what she wanted. "Your homework from yesterday," Ms. Blake said, holding up his paper. "It's quite messy. You need to work on your handwriting." Caleb's brow furrowed in confusion. He had spent extra time making sure his writing was neat and legible. "I'm sorry, Ms. Blake. I'll try harder next time." "See that you do," she replied dismissively, waving him away. As Caleb walked out of the classroom, a familiar voice called out to him. "Hey, champ, how was school today?" Caleb's face lit up at the sight of his father, David Johnson, leaning against their family car in the parking lot. David was a tall, distinguished-looking man with kind eyes and a warm smile that never failed to make Caleb feel safe and loved. "Dad!" Caleb exclaimed, running to give his father a big hug. "I thought Mom was picking me up today." David ruffled Caleb's curly hair affectionately. "I finished up at the office early and thought I'd surprise you. So, tell me all about your day." As they drove home, Caleb chattered excitedly about the things he had learned, carefully omitting any mention of Ms. Blake's cold treatment. He didn't want to worry his parents, and besides, he was determined to win her approval on his own. "That's great, son," David said proudly. You know, your mom and I are so impressed by how hard you work at school. Keep it up, and there's nothing you can't achieve." Caleb beamed at his father's words, feeling a surge of confidence. Maybe if he just tried a little harder, Ms. Blake would finally notice his efforts. As they pulled into the driveway of their modest but well-kept home, Caleb saw his mother, Tina, waiting for them on the porch. Her warm brown eyes crinkled with joy as she waved to them. "There are my two favorite men," Tina called out, enveloping Caleb in a tight hug as soon as he was within reach. "How about we have some cookies and milk while you tell me all about your day?" Inside, as Caleb munched on chocolate chip cookies, his favorite, he regaled his parents with stories from school, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. David and Tina exchanged proud glances over their son's head, marveling at his intelligence and zest for learning. "Caleb," David said, leaning in conspiratorially, "do you remember what I always tell you about facing challenges?" Caleb nodded vigorously, reciting the words he had heard countless times. "Stand tall and never let anyone make you feel small." "That's right," David affirmed, giving Caleb a gentle squeeze. "You're a bright, kind, and amazing boy. Don't ever forget that." Later that evening, as Caleb sat at his desk working on his homework, he thought about his father's words. He was determined to make his parents proud and show Ms. Blake what he was capable of. With renewed enthusiasm, he carefully wrote out each answer, making sure his handwriting was as neat as possible. As the days passed, Caleb continued to excel in his schoolwork, always eager to participate in class discussions. However, Ms. Blake's attitude towards him remained unchanged. She consistently overlooked his raised hand, offered minimal praise for his correct answers, and seemed to find fault with even his best efforts. One particularly frustrating morning, Caleb volunteered to solve a difficult math problem on the blackboard. He worked through it methodically, double-checking each step before presenting his solution to the class. "Well," Ms. Blake said, her tone cool, "that's one way to do it. But it's not the most efficient method. Can anyone else show us a better way?" Caleb's cheeks burned with embarrassment as he returned to his seat. He had solved the problem correctly, hadn't he? Why wasn't that good enough? During recess, Caleb sat alone on a bench, watching his classmates play. His usual cheerful demeanor was subdued as he pondered Ms. Blake's words. Was he really not as smart as he thought he was? "Hey, Caleb," a voice called out. It was Tyler, the boy Ms. Blake often praised. "Want to play basketball with us?" Caleb hesitated for a moment, then smiled and nodded. As he joined the game, he pushed his worries aside, losing himself in the simple joy of playing with his friends. That afternoon, as Caleb walked home with his mother, Tina noticed her usually talkative son was uncharacteristically quiet. "Is everything okay, sweetie?" she asked gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. Caleb looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Mom, am I smart?" Tina's heart clenched at the vulnerability in her son's voice. She knelt down to his level, looking him straight in the eyes. "Caleb, you are one of the smartest, kindest, most wonderful boys I know. Why would you even ask that?" Caleb shrugged, scuffing his shoe against the sidewalk. "I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm not good enough." Tina pulled her son into a tight hug, her mind racing. What could have happened to make her confident, bright boy doubt himself like this? She made a mental note to discuss this with David later. "Listen to me, Caleb," she said firmly, holding him at arm's length. "You are more than good enough. You're exceptional. Don't ever let anyone make you think otherwise, okay?" Caleb nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Okay, Mom." That night, after Caleb had gone to bed, Tina and David sat in the living room, discussing their son's unusual behavior. "I'm worried, David," Tina said, her brow furrowed with concern. "Caleb's always been so sure of himself. To hear him doubt his abilities like that, it breaks my heart." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Has he mentioned any problems at school? With his teacher, perhaps?" Tina shook her head. "No, he hasn't said anything specific. But I can't shake the feeling that something's not right." "We'll keep a close eye on him," David decided, reaching out to squeeze his wife's hand reassuringly. "If there's something going on, we'll figure it out together." The autumn sun streamed through the windows of Ms. Blake's classroom, casting a warm glow over the eager faces of her third-grade students. It was Friday afternoon, and the children were buzzing with excitement for the weekend ahead. Ms. Blake stood at the front of the room, her stern expression a stark contrast to the cheerful atmosphere. "All right, class," she announced, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Before we wrap up for the day, I have an important assignment for you all." A collective groan rippled through the room, but Caleb Johnson sat up straighter, his brown eyes shining with interest. He loved a challenge, especially when it came to schoolwork. Ms. Blake continued, "I want you to write a 2-page essay about your favorite historical figure. Tell me why you admire them and how they've made a difference in the world. This is due on Monday, so you'll have the whole weekend to work on it." As she explained the details of the assignment, Caleb's mind raced with possibilities. He already knew who he wanted to write about: Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American Supreme Court Justice. His father had told him stories about Marshall's fight for civil rights, and Caleb found him fascinating. When the final bell rang, Caleb carefully wrote down the assignment details in his notebook. As he packed up his things, he overheard some of his classmates complaining about having homework over the weekend. "This is so unfair," Emily whined. "I was supposed to go to the movies on Saturday." "Yeah," Tyler agreed. "Who wants to spend their weekend writing a boring essay?" Caleb kept quiet, but inside, he was brimming with excitement. He couldn't wait to get home and start working on his essay. As he walked out of the classroom, Ms. Blake's voice stopped him. "Caleb," she called, her tone neutral, "I expect to see a significant improvement in your work this time. No excuses." Caleb nodded solemnly. "Yes, Ms. Blake. I'll do my best." As he left the school building, Caleb spotted his mother's car in the pickup line. He ran over, his backpack bouncing against his back. "Hi, Mom," he chirped as he climbed into the back seat. Tina smiled warmly at her son through the rearview mirror. "Hello, sweetie. How was your day?" "It was good," Caleb replied, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "We got a really interesting homework assignment for the weekend. Can we stop by the library? I want to get some books for research." Tina's eyebrows raised in surprise. It wasn't often that a child asked to go to the library for homework. "Of course, honey. What's the assignment about?" As they drove to the library, Caleb explained the essay project, his words tumbling out in a rush of excitement. Tina listened attentively, her heart swelling with pride at her son's eagerness to learn. At the library, Caleb darted straight to the biography section, his eyes scanning the shelves until he found what he was looking for. With help from the kind librarian, he checked out several books about Thurgood Marshall and the civil rights movement. That evening, after dinner, Caleb spread his books and notebook across the kitchen table. His parents exchanged amused glances as they watched him work, his small face scrunched up in concentration. "Need any help, champ?" David asked, ruffling Caleb's curly hair as he passed by. Caleb shook his head, not looking up from his writing. "No thanks, Dad. I've got this." David and Tina shared a proud smile. Their son's determination and love for learning never ceased to amaze them. As the weekend progressed, Caleb threw himself into the assignment with gusto. He spent hours reading, taking notes, and carefully crafting his essay. By Sunday evening, he had a neatly written 2-page essay that he couldn't wait to turn in. "Mom, Dad," he called out, racing into the living room where his parents were watching TV. "Can you read my essay? I want to make sure it's perfect before I turn it in tomorrow." David took the pages from Caleb's outstretched hands, adjusting his reading glasses. As he read aloud, Tina leaned in, both of them hanging on every word. Caleb stood nervously, fidgeting with the hem of his t-shirt as he waited for their verdict. When David finished reading, he looked up at Caleb, his eyes shining with pride. "Son, this is excellent work. You've really captured why Thurgood Marshall was such an important figure in history." Tina nodded in agreement. "I'm so impressed, Caleb. You should be very proud of yourself." Caleb beamed, his chest puffing up with pride. "Do you think Ms. Blake will like it?" "She'd be crazy not to," David assured him, giving Caleb a warm hug. That night, as Caleb lay in bed, he could hardly sleep from excitement. He couldn't wait to turn in his essay and show Ms. Blake how hard he had worked. Monday morning arrived, and Caleb practically bounced into Ms. Blake's classroom. He carefully placed his essay on her desk, right on top of the pile of other students' work. "Good morning, Ms. Blake," he said cheerfully. "I finished my essay. I worked really hard on it all weekend." Ms. Blake barely glanced up from her computer. "That's fine, Caleb. Take your seat." Throughout the day, Caleb found it hard to concentrate on his lessons. His mind kept wandering to his essay, wondering what Ms. Blake would think of it. When the final bell rang, Ms. Blake announced that she would return their graded essays the next day. That night, Caleb chattered excitedly about his essay over dinner. "I can't wait to see what grade I get," he said between bites of mashed potatoes. "I think it's the best thing I've ever written." David and Tina exchanged proud glances. "We're sure you did wonderfully, sweetie," Tina said, reaching out to squeeze Caleb's hand. The next morning, Caleb practically ran to school, his heart pounding with anticipation. As he entered the classroom, he saw Ms. Blake placing the graded essays on each student's desk. He took his seat, trying to peek at the paper as Ms. Blake set it down. But Ms. Blake's hand covered the top of the page as she placed it on his desk. "I hope you learn from this, Caleb," she said, her voice low and cold. Confused, Caleb waited until she moved away before looking at his essay. His eyes widened in shock as he saw the large red C scrawled at the top of the page. But it was the comment written beneath the grade that made his heart drop to his stomach. In Ms. Blake's neat handwriting were the words, "Sloppy work, typical for someone like you." Caleb blinked hard, sure he must be seeing things. He read the words again and again, each time feeling like a punch to his gut. What did she mean? Someone like you? And how was his work sloppy? He had tried so hard, had been so careful. As the lesson began, Caleb barely heard a word Ms. Blake said. His mind was reeling, trying to make sense of the cruel comment. He glanced around at his classmates, wondering if anyone else had received similar feedback. But he saw smiles on many faces as they looked at their graded essays. When recess came, Caleb couldn't bring himself to join his friends on the playground. Instead, he sat alone on a bench, staring at the offending words on his essay. He felt a lump forming in his throat and blinked rapidly to keep the tears at bay. "Hey, Caleb," Tyler called out, running over with a soccer ball tucked under his arm. "Want to play with us?" Caleb shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. Tyler shrugged and ran off to join the others, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts. As the day wore on, Caleb grew quieter and more withdrawn. When the final bell rang, he stuffed his essay deep into his backpack, not wanting anyone to see it. He trudged out of the school building, his usual bounce gone from his step. "How was your day, sweetie?" Tina asked as Caleb climbed into the car. "Did you get your essay back?" Caleb nodded silently, staring out the window. Tina frowned, sensing something was wrong. "And? How did you do?" "Fine," Caleb mumbled, not meeting his mother's eyes in the rearview mirror. Tina's frown deepened, but she decided not to push further for now. The drive home was unusually quiet, with Caleb lost in his own thoughts. At home, Caleb went straight to his room, claiming he had a lot of homework to do. David and Tina exchanged worried glances, but decided to give their son some space. As evening fell, Caleb sat on his bed, the essay spread out before him. He read Ms. Blake's comment over and over, each time feeling a fresh wave of hurt and confusion. What had he done wrong? Was he really as sloppy and worthless as Ms. Blake seemed to think? A soft knock on his door startled him out of his thoughts. "Caleb," David's voice called. "Dinner's ready, son." Caleb quickly shoved the essay under his pillow. "I'm not hungry, Dad," he called back, his voice quavering slightly. There was a pause, then the sound of the door opening. David stepped into the room, his face etched with concern. "Are you feeling okay, champ? You've been awfully quiet since you got home." Caleb nodded, not trusting himself to speak. David sat down on the edge of the bed, placing a gentle hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" David said softly. "If something's bothering you." For a moment, Caleb was tempted to pull out the essay and show his father. But then he imagined the disappointment on his dad's face when he saw the grade, the shame of admitting that his teacher thought he was sloppy and worthless. The words stuck in his throat. "I'm just tired, Dad," Caleb mumbled, looking down at his hands. "Can I skip dinner tonight?" David studied his son's face for a long moment, clearly unconvinced. But finally he nodded. "All right, son, but if you get hungry later, there's a plate for you in the fridge, okay?" After David left, Caleb pulled out the essay again. As he stared at Ms. Blake's harsh words, He felt a deep sadness settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had always loved school, had always been proud of his abilities. But now he wasn't sure of anything anymore. That night, Caleb tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Ms. Blake's words echoed in his mind, mixing with his own doubts and fears. Was she right? Was he really not as smart as he thought he was? Was he less than the other kids somehow? The next morning, Caleb dragged himself out of bed, dreading the thought of going to school. As he got dressed, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. For the first time, he found himself really looking at his reflection, at the rich brown of his skin, the tight curls of his hair. Was this what Miss Blake meant by someone like you? The thought made his stomach churn. He had always been proud of who he was, of his family and his heritage. But now, a seed of doubt had been planted, and he didn't know how to uproot it. At breakfast, Caleb pushed his cereal around in his bowl, barely eating a bite. Tina watched him with growing concern. "Caleb, honey, are you feeling all right?" she asked, placing a hand on his forehead to check for fever. Caleb nodded, not meeting her eyes. "I'm fine, Mom, just not very hungry." As days passed, Caleb's usual enthusiasm for school began to wane. He no longer raised his hand in class, afraid that any answer he gave would be wrong or sloppy. He stopped volunteering to read aloud or solve problems on the board. Even at recess, he often chose to sit alone rather than join in the games with his classmates. Caleb's grades began to slip. Where once he had proudly brought home A's, now his papers were marked with C's and even a few D's. Each poor grade felt like a confirmation of Ms. Blake's words, proof that he really was sloppy and incapable. At home, David and Tina grew increasingly worried about their son's change in behavior. Caleb, once so talkative and eager to share his day, now gave only monosyllabic answers when asked about school. He spent more time alone in his room, and his usual bright smile had dimmed. One evening, as David and Tina sat in the living room after Caleb had gone to bed, they discussed their concerns. "I don't know what's going on with him," Tina said, her voice tight with worry. "It's like all the light has gone out of him. This isn't our Caleb." David nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "I've tried talking to him, but he just says everything's fine. But I can see it in his eyes, Tina. Something's hurting our boy. Should we talk to his teacher?" Tina suggested. "Maybe Ms. Blake has noticed something at school?" David considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "Let's give it a little more time. Caleb's a strong kid. If there's really a problem, I trust him to come to us when he's ready." But as another week passed, Caleb showed no signs of returning to his old self. He went through his days like a shadow, quiet and withdrawn. The essay remained hidden under his mattress, a secret weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. One night, unable to sleep, Caleb crept out of bed and retrieved the essay from its hiding place. He sat on the floor, his back against the bed, and read the words again in the dim light filtering through his window. "Sloppy work, typical for someone like you." As he stared at the harsh red letters, Caleb felt something inside him crumble. The tears he had been holding back for days finally spilled over, running hot down his cheeks. He buried his face in his hands, his small body shaking with silent sobs. He didn't understand why Ms. Blake had written those words. He didn't understand why being someone like him was a bad thing. All he knew was that it hurt, deep down in a place he couldn't reach, and he didn't know how to make it stop. In that moment, curled up on his bedroom floor with his tear-stained essay clutched to his chest, Caleb felt more alone than he ever had before. The confident, curious boy who had been so excited about his assignment seemed like a distant memory. One evening, as Tina was tidying up Caleb's room, she noticed a corner of paper sticking out from under his mattress. Curious, she gently tugged it free, realizing it was a school assignment. As she unfolded the paper, her eyes widened in shock at the words written in red at the top. "Sloppy work, typical for someone like you." Tina's hand flew to her mouth, her heart pounding with a mix of horror and fury. How could a teacher write such a cruel, racist comment to a child? And why had Caleb hidden this from them? Just then, she heard a small gasp from the doorway. Turning, she saw Caleb standing there, his eyes wide with fear as he realized his secret had been discovered. "Oh, Caleb," Tina breathed, her voice breaking. She opened her arms, and after a moment's hesitation, Caleb ran into them, burying his face in her shoulder as the dam finally broke. Huge, heaving sobs racked Caleb's small body as weeks of pent-up hurt and confusion poured out. Tina held him tightly, her own tears falling silently as she stroked his hair. "I'm so sorry, baby," she murmured. "I'm so sorry you've been carrying this all alone." When Caleb's sobs finally subsided to hiccups, Tina gently led him to sit on the bed. Keeping an arm around him, she asked softly, "Can you tell me what happened, sweetie?" In a halting voice, Caleb recounted the story of the essay, of how proud he had been of his work, and how crushed he felt when he saw Ms. Blake's comment. As he spoke, fresh tears rolled down his cheeks. "I tried so hard, Mom," he whispered. "I don't understand why she said that. Am I really sloppy? Is there something wrong with me? Because I'm like me?" Tina's heart shattered at the pain and confusion in her son's voice. She pulled him close, wishing she could shield him from the cruelty of the world. "Listen to me, Caleb," she said firmly, looking into his eyes. "There is absolutely nothing wrong with you. You are smart, kind, and wonderful just the way you are. What Ms. Blake wrote was wrong and hurtful, and it says much more about her than it does about you." Just then, they heard the front door open and close, signaling David's return from work. Tina gave Caleb a gentle squeeze. "I think we need to talk to your dad about this. Is that okay?" Caleb nodded hesitantly, and Tina called out, "David, can you come up here, please? We need to talk." Moments later, David appeared in the doorway, his smile fading as he took in the tear-stained faces of his wife and son. "What's going on?" he asked, concern etching his features. Wordlessly, Tina handed him the essay. David's expression darkened as he read Ms. Blake's comment, his jaw clenching with barely suppressed anger. "Caleb," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "how long have you been keeping this to yourself?" Caleb looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since we got the essays back. I was ashamed. I thought maybe she was right about me." David knelt in front of his son, gently taking Caleb's small hands in his own. "Son, look at me," he said softly. When Caleb's tear-filled eyes met his, David continued, "What Ms. Blake wrote has absolutely nothing to do with your worth or your abilities. You are an incredibly bright, hard-working boy, and we are so proud of you." "But," Caleb hiccuped, "but why would she say that if it wasn't true? Why doesn't she like me?" David took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes, Caleb, people say hurtful things because of their own problems or fears. It doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make it true. Ms. Blake's words reflect her prejudice, not your worth." Tina nodded in agreement. "Remember all the times you've made us proud? All the great grades you've gotten? All the kind things you've done for others? That's who you really are, Caleb, not what one misguided teacher says." Caleb looked between his parents, a tiny spark of hope flickering in his eyes. So I'm not sloppy? I'm not less than the other kids?" "Absolutely not," David said firmly. "You are every bit as capable and valuable as any other child in that class. More so because you have the strength to endure unfair treatment and still try your best." For the first time in weeks, a small smile tugged at the corners of Caleb's mouth. "I've been so scared," he admitted. "I thought if I told you, you'd be disappointed in me." Tina pulled him into another hug. "Oh, sweetheart, we could never be disappointed in you for something like this. We're just sad that you've been carrying this burden alone for so long." David's expression grew serious. "Caleb, I want you to know that what Ms. Blake did was wrong. It's not okay for a teacher or anyone to say things like that. We're going to handle this situation as a family, okay?" Caleb nodded, a mix of relief and apprehension on his face. What are we going to do?" David squeezed his son's shoulder reassuringly. "First, we're going to have a talk with the principal. Ms. Blake needs to understand that her behavior is unacceptable. But more importantly, we're going to make sure you know just how special and capable you are." Tina nodded in agreement. "And Caleb, from now on, I want you to promise that if anyone ever says something like this to you again, you'll tell us right away. You don't have to face these things alone." Caleb looked between his parents, feeling a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. I promise, he said softly. David ruffled Caleb's hair affectionately. That's my boy. Now, how about we all go downstairs and have some ice cream? I think we could all use a little treat after this heavy conversation. As they made their way downstairs, Caleb walking between his parents with a hand in each of theirs, he felt a spark of his old self returning. The hurt wasn't gone, and he knew there would be challenges ahead, but he no longer felt alone. With his family by his side, he felt strong enough to face whatever came next. Later that night, as Tina tucked Caleb into bed, she noticed a change in his demeanor. The tension that had been evident in his small frame for weeks seemed to have eased, and there was a glimmer of his old spark in his eyes. "Mom," Caleb said as she was about to turn off the light. "Yes, sweetie?" Caleb hesitated for a moment, then said softly, "Thank you for listening and for making me feel better. I love you." Tina felt her heart swell with love and pride. "I love you too, Caleb, more than you could ever know. Sweet dreams, my brave boy." As she closed the door, leaving it open just to crack the way Caleb liked it, Tina felt a mix of emotions washing over her. There was still anger at Ms. Blake for her cruel words and sadness that her son had to face such prejudice at such a young age. But overwhelmingly, there was pride in Caleb's strength and resilience, and determination to ensure that he never doubted his worth again. In the hallway, she found David waiting for her, his face a mirror of her own complex emotions. "How is he?" David asked softly. Tina leaned into her husband's embrace, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "He's okay. Better than okay, actually. Our boy is stronger than we give him credit for." David nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We'll get through this, Tina, as a family, and we'll make sure Caleb knows just how amazing he is, no matter what anyone else says." As they walked downstairs, both lost in thought about the challenges ahead, they were united in their love for their son and their commitment to fighting against the injustice he had faced. They knew the road ahead might not be easy, but they were ready to face it together as a family. The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when the Johnson household stirred to life. There was a palpable tension in the air as David and Tina prepared for their meeting at Caleb's school. Caleb, still in his pajamas, sat at the kitchen table, pushing his cereal around in his bowl, his stomach too knotted with anxiety to eat. "Are you sure I can't come with you?" Caleb asked, his voice small and uncertain. Tina knelt beside him, gently squeezing his shoulder. "Not this time, sweetheart. Your dad and I need to handle this part. But I promise we'll tell you everything when we get back, okay?" Caleb nodded, his eyes full of worry. "What if Miss Blake gets mad? What if she treats me worse after this?" David, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror, overheard and came to join them. "Caleb, look at me," he said, his voice firm but kind. "What Miss Blake did was wrong, and it's our job as your parents to make sure it doesn't happen again. You don't need to worry about anything. We got this, okay?" A small smile tugged at Caleb's lips. "Okay, Dad." As David and Tina prepared to leave, Caleb's babysitter, Mrs. Rodriguez from next door, arrived. She was a kind-faced woman who had known Caleb since he was a baby. "Don't you worry about a thing, Mijo," she said, giving Caleb a warm hug. "Your parents will sort everything out." With final reassurances to Caleb, David and Tina left for the school. The drive was quiet, both lost in thought about the confrontation ahead. At Oakwood Elementary, Principal Hayes was waiting for them in the school office. He was a tall, lean man with salt and pepper hair and a usually jovial demeanor, though today his face was creased with concern. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, thank you for coming in," he said, shaking their hands. "Ms. Blake will be joining us shortly. Shall we head to the conference room?" As they settled into their seats, Ms. Blake swept into the room. Her face was set in a mask of cool professionalism, but there was a hint of annoyance in her eyes. "Good morning," she said crisply, taking a seat across from David and Tina. "I understand there's been some concern about my teaching methods." Principal Hayes cleared his throat. "Ms. Blake, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson have brought a serious issue to our attention regarding a comment you made on their son Caleb's homework." David pulled out the essay and placed it on the table, Ms. Blake's red comment clearly visible. "Ms. Blake, can you explain why you thought it appropriate to write this on a child's homework?" Ms. Blake glanced at the paper, her expression unchanged. I don't see what the issue is here. It was a simple critique of the work submitted. Perhaps you're overreacting a bit. Tina's eyes flashed with anger, but David placed a calming hand on her arm. He turned to Ms. Blake, his voice level. Ms. Blake, you wrote sloppy work, typical for someone like you. Can you clarify what you meant by someone like you? Ms. Blake shrugged, a dismissive smile playing on her lips. I simply meant that Caleb's work has been consistently below par. The comment was meant to motivate him to do better. And you don't see how your words could be interpreted as racially motivated? David pressed. Ms. Blake's smile faltered slightly. I think you're reading too much into a harmless critique. I treat all my students equally. David leaned forward, his calm demeanor belying the steel in his voice. Ms. Blake, I'm a civil rights attorney. I've spent my career fighting against discrimination in all its forms, including the subtle, insidious kind that often goes unnoticed in our education system. Ms. Blake's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. David continued, your comment, intentional or not, carries racial undertones that have deeply affected my son. Caleb, who has always loved learning, now dreads coming to school. His grades have slipped, and he's withdrawn from activities he once enjoyed, all because of 9 thoughtless words you wrote on his paper. Principal Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the gravity of the situation dawning on him. Ms. Blake, if what Mr. Johnson is saying is true, this is a very serious matter. Ms. Blake's composure was crumbling. I never meant. It was just a comment on his work, nothing more. Tina, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Ms. Blake, do you have any idea how much damage your words have caused? Caleb has been carrying this hurt for weeks, too ashamed to tell us because he thought maybe you were right about him. Principal Hayes turned to David and Tina, his face etched with concern. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I want to apologize on behalf of the school. We have clearly failed in our duty to provide a safe and nurturing environment for Caleb. Ms. Blake, realizing the depth of trouble she was in, began to backpedal. I never intended any harm. Perhaps I could apologize to Caleb, explain that I didn't mean. I'm afraid it's not that simple, David interrupted. The damage has been done. And frankly, Ms. Blake, your initial dismissal of our concerns suggests that you don't fully grasp the seriousness of your actions. Principal Hayes nodded gravely. I agree. Ms. Blake, I'm placing you on administrative leave effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Ms. Blake's face paled. But my career, you can't do this. We can, and we must, Principal Hayes replied firmly. Discrimination of any kind has no place in our school. David turned to the principal. Mr. Hayes, while I appreciate your swift action, I hope you understand that this issue goes beyond Ms. Blake. We need to address the systemic problems that allowed this to happen in the first place. Principal Hayes nodded solemnly. You're absolutely right, Mr. Johnson. I assure you, we will be implementing comprehensive sensitivity training for all staff and reviewing our policies to ensure nothing like this happens again. As the meeting concluded, Ms. Blake sat shell-shocked, the reality of her situation sinking in. David and Tina, though relieved that action was being taken, felt the weight of the work still to be done. In the parking lot, as they prepared to head home, Tina turned to David. Do you think we did the right thing? Will this really make a difference? David pulled her into a hug. It's a start, Tina. We've opened their eyes to a problem they didn't even realize existed. It won't fix everything overnight, but it's a step in the right direction. As they drove home, both were lost in thought about the challenges ahead, not just for Caleb, but for all children facing similar prejudices. The confrontation was over, but the real work was just beginning. Back at home, Caleb was waiting anxiously by the window. As soon as he saw his parents' car pull into the driveway, he ran to the door, Mrs. Rodriguez close behind. How did it go? Caleb asked, his eyes wide with anticipation and a hint of fear. David knelt down to Caleb's level, placing his hands on his son's shoulders. It went well, champ. Ms. Blake won't be teaching your class anymore, and the school is going to make some big changes to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. Caleb's brow furrowed. Is Ms. Blake in trouble because of me? Tina joined them, smoothing Caleb's curly hair. No, sweetie. Ms. Blake is facing consequences for her own actions. You were brave to tell us what happened, and because of that, the school can now make things better for everyone." A small smile tugged at Caleb's lips. "So, I did a good thing." "You did a very good thing," David affirmed. "You stood up against something that was wrong, and that takes a lot of courage." Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Caleb, mi niño, you should be very proud of yourself. And you have wonderful parents who fight for you." As Mrs. Rodriguez prepared to leave, Caleb turned to his parents. "What happens now?" David and Tina exchanged glances. "Well," David began, "you'll have a new teacher for a while, and Dad's going to work with the school to help them understand why what happened was wrong and how to prevent it in the future." Tina added, "And we're going to make sure you know just how special and capable you are, no matter what anyone else says." As the family moved to the kitchen to prepare lunch together, there was a sense of a new chapter beginning. The confrontation at the school had been difficult, but it had also opened doors for positive change. While David made sandwiches, he reflected on the meeting. "You know, Tina," he said quietly, so Caleb wouldn't overhear, "I think we made some real progress today. But there's still so much work to be done." Tina nodded, her eyes on Caleb as he carefully poured glasses of juice. "I know, but seeing how Caleb's handled all this, it gives me hope, you know? If we can raise children who understand these issues and are willing to stand up against injustice, maybe we can create real change." David smiled, squeezing his wife's hand. "You're right. It won't be easy, but it's worth fighting for. For Caleb, and for all the kids out there facing similar challenges." As they sat down to eat, the mood was lighter than it had been in weeks. The confrontation at the school had been a turning point, not just for Caleb, but for the entire Johnson family. They had faced a difficult truth together and had emerged stronger, more united in their commitment to fighting injustice wherever they found it. As evening approached, the family settled in the living room for a movie night, a tradition they hadn't enjoyed in weeks due to the tension surrounding Caleb's situation. As they cuddled together on the couch, Caleb between his parents, there was a palpable sense of relief and renewed closeness. Halfway through the movie, Caleb looked up at his father. "Dad," he said softly. "Yes, son? Thank you for standing up for me today. I want to be brave like you when I grow up." David felt a lump form in his throat. "Caleb, you're already brave. What you've been through, how you've handled it, that takes real courage. I'm proud of you, son." Tina leaned in, wrapping her arm around both of them. "We both are, sweetheart. So very proud." As the credits rolled, Caleb had fallen asleep between them, looking more peaceful than he had in weeks. David carefully lifted him, carrying him to bed while Tina turned down the covers. Once Caleb was tucked in, David and Tina stood in the doorway, watching their sleeping son. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated his face. So young, and yet already touched by the harsh realities of the world. "We can't protect him from everything," Tina whispered, leaning into David's side. "No," David agreed, "but we can give him the tools to face whatever comes his way. And we can keep fighting to make the world a little bit better for him and for all children." As they closed Caleb's door, leaving it open just to crack the way he liked it, David and Tina felt a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation at the school had been just the beginning. There would be more battles ahead, more injustices to face. But they would face them together, as a family, with love, courage, and an unwavering commitment to making a difference. The autumn leaves were falling outside Oakwood Elementary as Caleb Johnson stepped into his classroom, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The familiar sight of Ms. Blake's stern face was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a warm smile greeted him from behind the teacher's desk. "Good morning, Caleb," Ms. Ramirez said, her eyes twinkling with kindness. "Ready for another exciting day?" Caleb nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. It had been 2 weeks since his parents' meeting with the principal, and the change in the classroom atmosphere was palpable. Gone was the constant fear of criticism, replaced by an environment that encouraged questions and celebrated effort. As Caleb settled into his seat, he overheard 2 of his classmates whispering. "Did you hear about Ms. Blake?" Emily asked Tyler in a hushed tone. Tyler nodded solemnly. "My mom said she's in big trouble. She might never teach again. Caleb's stomach twisted with a mix of emotions. He was relieved that Miss Blake was gone, but a small part of him felt guilty. Had he ruined someone's entire career? Later that day, as Caleb walked home with his father, David sensed his son's inner turmoil. "What's on your mind, champ?" David asked gently. Caleb kicked a pebble along the sidewalk, his brow furrowed. "Dad, is it true that Miss Blake might never teach again?" David sighed, choosing his words carefully. "It's possible, son. The school board is looking into everything that happened. They need to make sure all students are safe and treated fairly. But did I do that to her?" Caleb's voice was barely above a whisper. David stopped walking and knelt down to Caleb's level, placing his hands on his son's shoulders. "Caleb, listen to me. You did nothing wrong. Ms. Blake made choices that hurt you and probably other students too. She's facing the consequences of her own actions, not yours." Caleb nodded slowly, processing his father's words. "I guess I just feel weird about it all." David pulled his son into a hug. "That's okay, Caleb. It's normal to have mixed feelings. What you're feeling shows that you have a big heart. But remember, standing up against unfairness is always the right thing to do." As they continued their walk home, David decided to seize the moment for a deeper conversation. "You know, Caleb, I'm really proud of how you've handled all of this. It takes a lot of courage to speak up when someone in authority is treating you unfairly." Caleb looked up at his father, his eyes wide with surprise. "Really? But I was scared. I didn't even want to tell you and Mom at first." David smiled warmly. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing the right thing even when you were scared. And that's exactly what you did." As they approached their house, Caleb's steps slowed. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course, son. Anything." Caleb took a deep breath. "How do you do it? How do you stand up to people who are being unfair all the time? Isn't it hard?" David's heart swelled with pride at his son's thoughtful question. He led Caleb to the porch steps and sat down, patting the spot next to him. As Caleb settled in, David wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "It is hard, Caleb. Sometimes it feels like you're fighting an uphill battle. But you know what keeps me going?" David asked. Caleb shook his head, his eyes fixed on his father's face. "It's people like you," David said, giving Caleb's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Every time I see a child who's been hurt by unfairness but still has the strength to stand tall, it reminds me why this fight is so important." Caleb's face lit up with understanding. "So, me telling you about Ms. Blake, that helps other kids too?" David nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. "Exactly. Your courage doesn't just help you. It helps create a better world for everyone. That's why I'm so proud of you, son." As they sat there on the porch, the afternoon sun warming their faces, Caleb felt a new sense of purpose blooming inside him. He wasn't just a kid who had been hurt. He was someone who could make a difference. Over the next few weeks, Caleb's transformation was remarkable. With Ms. Ramirez's encouragement and his parents' unwavering support, he began to rediscover his love for learning. His hand shot up in class, eager to answer questions. His homework assignments were completed with enthusiasm, each one a chance to prove to himself that he was capable and smart. One evening, as Tina was helping Caleb with his math homework, she noticed a change in his demeanor. Gone was the hesitation, the fear of making mistakes. Instead, Caleb tackled each problem with confidence. "You're doing so well, sweetie," Tina said, ruffling his hair affectionately. "I'm so proud of how hard you're working." Caleb beamed at his mother's praise. "Thanks, Mom. You know, I used to be scared of getting things wrong. But Ms. Ramirez says mistakes are just chances to learn something new." Tina felt a lump form in her throat. The contrast between Ms. Ramirez's teaching philosophy and Ms. Blake's harsh criticism was stark. "That's absolutely right, Caleb. And you know what? That's true not just in school, but in life too." As Caleb returned to his homework, Tina watched him, marveling at his resilience. The past few months had been a roller coaster of emotions for their family, but seeing Caleb now, confident and happy, made it all worth it. Later that night, after Caleb had gone to bed, Tina found David in his study, poring over some legal documents. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts?" she murmured. David leaned back into her embrace, sighing heavily. I just got word from the school board. The investigation into Ms. Blake is complete. Tina tensed slightly. And she's been terminated. Permanently barred from teaching in this district, David said, his voice a mix of satisfaction and weariness. Tina let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It's over then. David nodded, turning to face his wife. In a way, yes. But in another way, it's just the beginning. The board has agreed to implement new training programs for all staff. They're revising their policies on discrimination and creating new channels for students and parents to report concerns. Tina smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You did it, David. You turned this horrible situation into something positive. David shook his head, pulling Tina close. We did it. All of us. Especially Caleb. His courage started all of this. As they held each other, both lost in thought about the journey they'd been through, they heard a small sound from the doorway. Turning, they saw Caleb standing there in his pajamas, clutching his stuffed bear. Caleb? What are you doing up, sweetie? Tina asked, concern etching her features. Caleb shuffled his feet, looking uncertain. I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about something. David beckoned his son over, lifting him onto his lap as he had when Caleb was younger. What's on your mind, champ? Caleb fiddled with his bear's ear, not meeting his parents' eyes. I was wondering, do you think there are other kids out there? Kids who feel bad about themselves because of what teachers or grown-ups say. David and Tina exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with pride at their son's empathy. I'm sure there are, Caleb, David said gently. Unfortunately, what happened to you isn't unique. Caleb looked up, his eyes shining with determination. Then we need to help them too. Can we do that, Dad? Can we help other kids like me? David felt a lump form in his throat. Of course we can, son. In fact, I think that's a wonderful idea. What did you have in mind? Caleb's face lit up with excitement. Maybe we could start a club at school? For kids who feel different or left out. We could talk about our feelings and help each other feel better. Tina wiped away a tear, amazed at her son's compassion. That's a beautiful idea, Caleb. I'm sure Ms. Ramirez and the principal would support it. David nodded in agreement. And you know what? I bet we could even expand it beyond just our school. Maybe create a program that could help kids all over the city. Caleb's eyes widened. Really? We could do that. David hugged his son close. With your ideas and courage, Caleb, I think we can do anything we set our minds to. As Caleb drifted off to sleep that night, his head full of plans for his new club, David and Tina stood in the doorway of his room, watching their son's peaceful face. He's amazing, isn't he? Tina whispered, leaning into David's side. David nodded, his arm tightening around his wife's waist. He really is. You know, when I became a civil rights attorney, I thought I was fighting for a better future. But Caleb, he is that better future. The next few months flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Caleb's idea for a support club took off, with Ms. Ramirez enthusiastically backing the project. The Everyone Belongs Club quickly became the most popular after-school activity at Oakwood Elementary. Caleb threw himself into the club with all the passion and energy of his 8-year-old heart. He worked with Ms. Ramirez to plan activities that celebrated diversity and promoted kindness. The club became a safe haven for kids who felt different or struggled to fit in. One afternoon, as David picked Caleb up from a club meeting, he couldn't help but marvel at the sight before him. Caleb was surrounded by a diverse group of children, all laughing and chatting animatedly. The shy, withdrawn boy of a few months ago was nowhere to be seen. In his place was a confident, compassionate leader who made sure everyone felt included. As they walked to the car, David ruffled Caleb's hair affectionately. Looks like the club is going great, champ. You should be really proud of what you've created. Caleb beamed up at his father. It's so much fun, Dad. Today, we had a Share Your Story session. Kids talked about times they felt left out or different. And you know what? Everyone was so kind and supportive. It made me realize we're all more alike than we are different. David felt a lump form in his throat. That's a pretty profound realization, Caleb. Some adults never learn that lesson. Caleb nodded solemnly. I just wish Ms. Blake could have seen that. Maybe if she had, she wouldn't have been so mean. David was struck by his son's empathy, even towards someone who had hurt him deeply. You're right, son. Sometimes people say hurtful things because they don't understand or they're afraid of differences. That's why what you're doing with this club is so important. You're teaching kids to celebrate differences instead of fearing them. As they drove home, Caleb chatted excitedly about future plans for the club. David listened, his heart swelling with pride. He couldn't help but think about how far they'd come since that fateful day when Caleb had received Ms. Blake's cruel comment. That evening, as the family sat down to dinner, there was a palpable sense of joy and contentment in the air. Caleb regaled his parents with more stories from the club, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. And next week, Caleb announced between bites of spaghetti, we're going to start planning a big assembly for the whole school. We want to share what we've been learning about kindness and inclusion with everyone. Tina smiled warmly at her son. That sounds wonderful, sweetie. I'm so proud of how you've turned a difficult experience into something positive for so many people. David nodded in agreement. You know, Caleb, I've been thinking, how would you feel about taking your message beyond Oakwood Elementary? Caleb's eyes widened. What do you mean, Dad? David leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. Well, remember how we talked about helping kids in other schools, too? I've been speaking with some colleagues, and we think your club could be a model for other schools in the district. Maybe even the whole state. Caleb's fork clattered to his plate. Really? You mean other schools could have Everyone Belongs clubs too? Tina reached out to squeeze Caleb's hand. If that's something you'd like to do, sweetheart. You're Dad, and I think you have an important message to share, but it's up to you. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Then he looked up, his face set with determination. I want to do it. If it can help other kids feel better about themselves, like it helped me, then I want to do it. David felt a surge of pride, so strong it almost overwhelmed him. That's my boy, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. As the weeks passed, Caleb's initiative began to attract attention beyond the walls of Oakwood Elementary. Local news stations ran stories about the young boy who had turned a personal experience with discrimination into a movement for inclusivity and kindness. Caleb, with his parents' support, spoke at school board meetings and education conferences. His simple message of acceptance and understanding touched hearts and opened minds. One evening, as the family sat watching a news segment about the spreading Everyone Belongs movement, Caleb turned to his parents, his expression thoughtful. Mom, Dad, he said softly, do you think Ms. Blake knows about all this? Tina and David exchanged glances. It was a question they had wondered about themselves. David pulled Caleb close. I'm not sure, son, but if she does, I hope she sees how much good has come from a situation that started out so painful. Caleb nodded, snuggling into his father's side. I hope so too, and I hope she learned something like we all did. Tina marveled at her son's capacity for forgiveness and growth. You know, Caleb, no matter what Ms. Blake thinks or does now, what matters is how you've chosen to respond to what happened. You've shown incredible strength and compassion. As the news segment ended, Caleb yawned widely. David chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. I think it's bedtime for our little world changer. Later that night, as David and Tina stood in the doorway of Caleb's room, watching their sleeping son, they felt a deep sense of peace and hope. He's going to change the world, isn't he? Tina whispered, leaning into David's side. David nodded, his arm tightening around his wife's waist. He already has, Tina. He already has. As they closed Caleb's door, leaving it open just a crack the way he liked it, they were filled with a sense of optimism for the future. They had faced a difficult challenge as a family and had not only overcome it, but had turned it into an opportunity to make the world a little bit better. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight against injustice and prejudice. But with Caleb's courage and compassion leading the way, they felt ready to face whatever came next. In the quiet of the night, as Caleb slept peacefully, dreams of a kinder, more inclusive world danced in his head. And in those dreams, a little boy who had once felt small and afraid stood tall, surrounded by friends of all colors and backgrounds, all of them knowing that they belonged. The story of Caleb Johnson, the boy who turned pain into purpose, was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning, but one thing was certain. The world was already a little bit brighter because of him. Caleb's story is a powerful reminder that bravery can shine through, even when faced with cruelty and injustice. His courage didn't just protect himself. It sent a message that no one should ever be made to feel less than they are. If Caleb's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Caleb's shoes?